Tunisia, February 1943. The desert wind scraped across the dunes, carrying the scent of oil and dust. In the distance, the blackened skeletons of burned-out tanks marked the chaos that had unfolded only hours earlier. Amid the debris of battle, German recovery teams moved methodically, collecting what remained of the Allied assault. Among the wreckage stood something unfamiliar, a boxy compact tank with a rounded turret and thick welded armor. It wasn't British. It wasn't French. Stenciled faintly on its side were white stars, an American tank captured nearly intact. Engineers from the Africa Corps gathered around it, intrigued. The machine was unlike the Panzers they knew, not elegant, not over-engineered, but solid, efficient, alive. They opened its hatches, examined its systems, and quickly realized that this vehicle, the M4 Sherman, had been built with an entirely different philosophy. In that moment, under the harsh African sun, the Germans began to understand something they hadn't faced before. America's greatest weapon wasn't a single tank. It was the power to build thousands of them, all working, all moving, all coming. When America entered World War II in December 1941, its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's, lightly mechanized and inexperienced in modern warfare. But in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, the foundations of something far greater were stirring. While Germany perfected its heavy Tigers and complex Panzers, American engineers were solving a different problem. Not how to build the most powerful tank, but how to build enough of them to win a global war. The M4 Sherman was born from that idea. Developed in 1941 and rushed into service the following year, it embodied American industrial logic, standardization, simplicity, and reliability. Every component could be produced in dozens of factories across the nation and still fit perfectly when assembled. Its radial aircraft engine, robust transmission, and all-welded hull were chosen not for elegance, but for endurance. By the time the first Shermans rolled off the production lines, America's vast manufacturing network was awakening. The auto industry, once devoted to sedans and trucks, now forged armor plates and tank engines. Women welded steel hulls under the glow of sparks. Railroad yards filled with olive-drab machines bound for North Africa, Britain, and the Pacific. Across the Atlantic, British commanders had been pleading for better armor. Their Crusaders and Valentines had suffered terribly against the German Panzer III and IV. When the first American Shermans arrived in late 1942, they were greeted with relief and curiosity. The tank wasn't perfect. Its high profile made it an easy target, and its 75mm gun wasn't powerful enough to pierce heavy German armor at long range. But what it lacked in raw firepower, it made up for in mechanical consistency. It worked every day, across desert heat and mud-filled terrain, where German machines often stalled, overheated, or simply broke down. When Operation Torch began in November 1942, the Allied landings in North Africa, the Sherman made its combat debut. Facing the battle-hardened Africa Corps under General Erwin Rommel, Allied tank crews learned quickly that survival wasn't just about armor thickness. It was about endurance, logistics, and recovery. German engineers soon captured several Shermans near Kasserine in Tunisia. When they began to study the machines, their initial reactions were dismissive. Too tall, too soft, too crude. But as they stripped the tank apart, they realized something disquieting. The Sherman never should have worked as well as it did, yet it always did. Its engine started in the cold without effort. Its transmission shifted smoothly after days of hard driving. The suspension, a simple vertical volute spring system, could be repaired in hours, not days. And perhaps most astonishingly, every part could be replaced using basic tools, even in the field. It was then that the German engineers understood the philosophy behind it. While Germany built machines of precision, America built machines of endurance. In Africa, the difference was already visible. Panzers that broke down in the desert often stayed broken. Shermans that were hit could be repaired, refitted, and returned to battle. The Allied lines grew stronger not because their tanks were superior in one-on-one combat, but because their machines kept moving. The Africa Corps' technical reports soon reached Berlin. The findings were troubling. The Sherman, they wrote, was mechanically primitive yet operationally remarkable. It could not outgun a Tiger, but it would still be there after hundreds of miles of dust. heat, and battle. That realization marked a turning point in German engineering thought. The Reich's factories were producing masterpieces, complex, powerful, but painfully slow to build and maintain. The Americans, by contrast, had mastered something the Germans had not: industrial reliability. And that reliability was about to roll across Europe like a tide no army could stop. By early 1943, America's war machine was no longer just an experiment, it was a phenomenon. Factories that once built Buicks, Studebakers, and Fords were now producing tanks, trucks, and artillery at a pace no other nation could match. Assembly lines ran day and night beneath the glare of fluorescent lights, filling entire city blocks with the rhythmic clang of steel and rivets. In Michigan, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, managed by Chrysler, became the beating heart of this revolution. Within months, it could deliver hundreds of Sherman tanks each week, each one rolling out with the same precision as the car industry's finest models. Engineers refined the process until it felt almost effortless. Cast hulls, welded armor, pre-tested engines. America wasn't just building weapons, it was building systems that could sustain an army across oceans. By mid-1943, Shermans were appearing everywhere: in the deserts of North Africa, the rocky hills of Sicily, and the muddy roads of Italy. The Allies learned to depend on them. Mechanics joked that if a Sherman couldn't be fixed, it probably wasn't worth fighting for. The tank had become a symbol, not of invincibility, but of unstoppable persistence. While German designers obsessed over perfection, chasing thicker armor, heavier guns, and more complex gearboxes, the Americans kept refining for function. The Sherman's later variants, like the M4A3, introduced better engines, improved armor, and eventually a high-velocity 76mm gun capable of challenging the German Panzer IV and even damaging a Panther from the flank. But the Sherman's true strength wasn't in any single upgrade. It was in how easily those upgrades could be distributed. Every improvement, a new track, a reinforced hull, a better gun sight, could be manufactured in hundreds of factories, shipped by rail, and installed in the field. In logistics terms, that was revolutionary. Across Europe, Allied armies moved forward with unprecedented momentum because their machines kept running. When a Sherman broke down, it was rarely abandoned. Spare parts arrived by the ton, driven by an army of trucks from depots stretching from Liverpool to Naples. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps ensured that no tank crew ever waited long. Meanwhile, the Germans fought a different kind of war, one their economy couldn't sustain. Their Tiger and Panther tanks were masterpieces of design but nightmares of logistics. Each required specialized components and intensive maintenance. Even in victory, they suffered under their own complexity. For every Tiger that reached the front, dozens of Shermans were already crossing the Channel. In Italy, Allied tank crews came to trust the Sherman's predictability. It climbed muddy slopes where heavier German tanks bogged down. It could be ferried across rivers or lifted onto landing craft. The tank wasn't loved for its looks. It was loved because it was there. And as 1944 dawned, the Sherman's greatest test loomed: the invasion of Western Europe. The Allies were preparing the largest amphibious assault in history, Operation Overlord. Every vehicle that rolled onto the beaches of Normandy had to work flawlessly. Failure wasn't an option. A single jammed engine could block an entire landing craft. On June 6, 1944, thousands of Shermans crossed the English Channel. Some sank before reaching shore. Others burned on the beaches under German fire. But the majority rolled forward, their engines roaring through sand and smoke, carrying the weight of liberation on their tracks. German commanders were stunned by the scale of what they faced. Not the brilliance of a single tank, but the relentless flood of them. Each destroyed Sherman was quickly replaced. Each breakdown was repaired. Each loss was absorbed by a system designed to outproduce and outlast its enemy. For the first time, the Germans began to grasp the true nature of the American war effort. This wasn't a contest of engineering superiority. It was a war of industrial willpower, and the Sherman was the embodiment of that will. A steel reminder that wars aren't always won by the strongest machine, but by the one that never stops moving, for the men who fought inside it. The Sherman was more than steel and machinery. It was a second home. Each crew of 5 shared the same cramped space: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver. They lived, fought, and sometimes died within inches of each other. The engine's heat filled the hull, the smell of oil and cordite clinging to their uniforms. When the hatches closed, it became a world of noise, motion, and faith in the machine beneath them. To outsiders, the Sherman looked unremarkable. But for those inside, its reliability meant survival. Drivers praised its steering and transmission. Simple, smooth, almost intuitive. Loaders valued the space to work efficiently. Commanders trusted that when they gave the order to move, the tank would respond instantly. Many tankers came from factories and farms, not military academies. They learned to repair their own machines with wrenches and grit. A Sherman crew could strip and replace a transmission in the field within a day. In contrast, German crews often waited days, sometimes weeks, for specialized mechanics to restore their tanks. That independence turned ordinary men into engineers, mechanics, and soldiers all at once. It was a quiet kind of strength, the ability to keep fighting without waiting for someone else to fix what broke. For the U.S. Army, the Sherman wasn't just a weapon, it was a doctrine on tracks. American commanders understood that victory came not from isolated tank duels, but from combined arms, the seamless coordination of infantry, artillery, air power, and armor. The Sherman's job wasn't to duel with tigers, it was to support the advance, break through defenses, and exploit openings. When the Luftwaffe lost control of the skies, this doctrine came alive. Allied fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and Typhoon hunted German armor from above. The Sherman filled the gap on the ground, pressing forward relentlessly. Together they created a battlefield where German tanks, no matter how powerful, could rarely dictate the terms of combat. But the Germans noticed something else, something that troubled them deeply. When engineers and officers inspected captured Shermans, they realized how consistent the design was. Whether the tank came from Detroit, Cleveland, or Los Angeles, the craftsmanship was the same. The same bolts, the same fittings, the same systems, and all interchangeable. To an American, that was obvious. To a German, it was staggering. Their own production lines were fragmented by shortages, air raids, and bureaucracy. Each model of Tiger or Panther might have slightly different parts depending on which factory built it. A gearbox from Kassel might not fit a hull from Nuremberg. That lack of standardization slowed repairs, drained resources, and turned every logistical problem into a crisis. The Sherman, meanwhile, represented the opposite, the triumph of uniformity. It was a tank that embodied the industrial logic of Henry Ford. Identical, replaceable, unstoppable, German engineers, accustomed to crafting precision masterpieces, began to admit something uncomfortable. The Americans had achieved something more powerful than perfection. They had achieved reliability at scale. A report from the German Army Weapons Office in 1943 noted, "The American tank is built for endurance, not excellence. Yet in the field, this endurance equals superiority." Those words reflected a subtle shift in how the Wehrmacht viewed its enemy. America's tanks were not admired for beauty or innovation. They were feared for their sheer persistence. For the Allies, that persistence carried a psychological weight. Every Sherman that returned from battle reinforced a sense of inevitability. Every repaired engine, every welded hull was proof that the machine and the nation behind it would not stop. And on the German side, that inevitability began to breed unease. Reports of endless convoys of Shermans moving toward the front lines were whispered across divisions. Crews spoke of fighting one column only to meet another the next day. For them, the Sherman wasn't a tank. It was a symbol of industrial power made real, a reminder that numbers, when built on reliability, could defeat brilliance. To understand why the Sherman succeeded, you have to look at the mindset behind it. American engineers designed for the soldier. German engineers designed for the engineer. In Detroit, the Sherman was imagined by men who thought in miles, hours, and tons. They wanted something a farm mechanic could fix with a wrench. They accepted compromises because they knew what mattered most wasn't brilliance on paper, but performance in the field. In Germany, engineers chased perfection. Every tank was a statement of craftsmanship, a reflection of a nation that saw engineering as art. The Panther, with its sloped armor and powerful 75mm gun, was an elegant predator. The Tiger, with its 88mm cannon, was a fortress on tracks. But both were fragile. Each demanded specialized tools, rare metals, and expert maintenance. Even the Reich's leaders were divided over this obsession. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, would later write that Germany's downfall wasn't a lack of courage. It was a failure to simplify. "We built the best machines," he said, "but we built too few of them." Across the ocean, the Americans were doing the opposite. Theirs was a democracy of machines, designed to be mass-produced, driven by ordinary men, and repaired by anyone with grease under their fingernails. That philosophy reflected their leadership too. General George S. Patton, one of the most famous American tank commanders, understood what the Sherman represented. To him, war wasn't about the perfect weapon, it was about momentum. He told his men, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." The Sherman fit that doctrine exactly. Under commanders like Patton and Bradley, American armored divisions learned to fight like a machine themselves, always moving, always pressing, never stopping long enough to be pinned down. When a Sherman was hit, another filled its place. When a road was blocked, engineers cleared it. The momentum never stopped. The Germans saw it firsthand. At Normandy in France and later across the Rhine, they realized that no matter how many tanks they destroyed, the American advance continued. It wasn't a matter of bravery or tactics. It was a matter of logistics. Behind every Sherman stood a mountain of industry. The tire plants of Akron, the foundries of Pennsylvania, the shipyards of New York. For every Tiger that rolled off the line, America produced 100 Shermans, and had the fuel, spare parts, and manpower to keep them running. Even German commanders came to respect that power. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, once observed that the Allies had mastered what Germany had pioneered, not in brilliance, but in execution. "They have done what we could not," he admitted in 1945. "They made Blitzkrieg permanent." But behind the steel and numbers, there was also a moral weight. The Sherman crews paid dearly for their victories. For every tank that returned, another burned. The term Ronson, borrowed from a lighter brand, became a grim nickname, referring to how quickly the tank could ignite when struck. In battles like Normandy's hedgerows and the frozen fields of the Ardennes, Sherman crews faced Tigers and Panthers that could destroy them from twice the distance. Many never saw their attackers, yet they fought on, relying on numbers, coordination, and courage. American commanders knew the price. They didn't glorify the machine. They respected what it enabled. Each tank loss meant 5 lives risked. Each victory another mile closer to ending the war. The German engineers who examined captured Shermans often wrote with grudging respect. They couldn't understand how something so simple could perform so consistently. In their reports, they described it as technically inferior but strategically superior. That phrase captured the paradox of the Sherman perfectly. In an age when nations tried to engineer victory, America had manufactured endurance, and endurance, more than innovation, was what decided the war. By 1944, the Sherman wasn't just a tank anymore. It was a message that the industrial age had changed the rules of war forever, that a nation's strength no longer came from a few perfect machines, but from the collective will to keep building, repairing, and fighting. For the German engineers watching their armies retreat, that realization was devastating. They had mastered precision. America had mastered power. And in the brutal arithmetic of total war, power always wins. By June 1944, Europe had become an armored continent. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Poland, every mile of ground was contested by steel. But when the Allies landed in France, something new was unleashed. Not a weapon, but an idea made real. The American Sherman, multiplied across thousands of units, became the physical proof of industrial inevitability. The landings on D-Day were only the beginning. After the beaches were secured, Allied armor had to push inland, through the bocage country of Normandy, a maze of hedgerows, sunken roads, and farm walls that turned every field into a fortress. German defenders waited behind every turn, and their Panthers and Tigers dominated the open ground. The first encounters were brutal. Shermans were picked off at long range by guns they couldn't even see. Tank crews spoke of hearing the whistle of incoming shells just seconds before impact. The frontline units, like the U.S. 2nd Armored Division and the British Guards Armored, suffered heavy losses. But the Allies adapted quickly. Engineers welded makeshift prongs and blades onto the fronts of Shermans to tear through the hedgerows. Rhino tanks, they called them. Infantry learned to move in close coordination, and artillery provided relentless cover. The U.S. Army turned chaos into coordination, and slowly, field by field, they broke through. In the German high command, frustration grew. Reports arrived daily of Allied tanks reappearing faster than they could be destroyed. A Panther might take a week to repair, if parts could even be found. A Sherman could be replaced within hours. What had started as tactical superiority for Germany was dissolving into strategic disaster. Then came Operation Cobra, the American breakout from St. Lo in late July 1944. After weeks of grinding through hedgerows, the Allies unleashed a concentrated air bombardment, followed by a massive armored thrust. When the dust settled, more than 1,000 Shermans poured through the gap. The German lines collapsed. General Omar Bradley's forces advanced at a pace the Wehrmacht couldn't comprehend. The roads were choked with American armor, columns stretching for miles, engines rumbling through the French countryside, every tank carrying the white star that now symbolized unstoppable progress. German tank commanders, even those commanding Panthers and Tigers, began to retreat, not because they were outgunned, but because they were outnumbered, outflanked, and outlasted. Their vehicles broke down faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages strangled mobility. Supply depots were bombed from the air. The Americans, by contrast, never seemed to slow down. Captured German reports from August 1944 describe an endless procession of enemy armor, impossible to contain. Another officer wrote, "Where one tank is destroyed, 2 more arrive the next morning." This was the turning point. The Tiger and Panther, once the terror of Europe, became symbols of overreach. Magnificent yet impractical in the face of American production. For every Tiger that reached the front, the U.S. Army had already landed dozens of Shermans, each capable of fighting, being repaired, and fighting again. As the Allies swept across France, small towns that had been under German control for years fell one after another. At Falaise, an entire German army was encircled. The Sherman was everywhere, on the ridges, in the valleys, across the roads, covering infantry and crushing resistance. For the German engineers who once studied the tank in North Africa, the sight was surreal. What they had once dismissed as crude had become unstoppable. Their own armored corps, once the pride of Blitzkrieg, was now retreating before a weapon they had underestimated. In Berlin, Hitler raged at reports of American armor breaking through faster than his commanders could respond. He demanded that the Tiger II, the so-called King Tiger, would be rushed to the front. But it was too late. The factories were failing, the supply lines collapsing, and the Luftwaffe could no longer protect the convoys. By autumn, the American advance reached the borders of Germany. Bridges were rebuilt faster than the enemy could destroy them. The same tanks that had fought in Africa were now crossing into Europe's heartland. And across the shattered fields of France, one fact became undeniable. The German army had built superior tanks, but America had built a superior system. The war had turned. The tide that began with a single captured Sherman in the desert had now become a flood of steel sweeping toward the Rhine. By late 1944, the war in Western Europe had transformed into a vast mechanical storm. The U.S. Army's armored columns pushed toward the Rhine, rolling through devastated villages and open plains once dominated by the Wehrmacht. The white star of the Sherman had become the mark of inevitability. It appeared in every battle, on every road, under every cloud of smoke. But the fight was not yet over. Germany's armies, battered but unbroken, prepared one last desperate counteroffensive, an attempt to split the Allied lines and reclaim the initiative. In December 1944, as snow blanketed the forests of Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge began. Under heavy fog and freezing cold, German forces struck with unexpected ferocity. Panzer divisions surged through the Ardennes, catching the Allies off guard. The offensive was bold, perhaps even brilliant, but it was fueled by the last reserves of German strength. The Sherman crews, exhausted and frozen, faced their hardest test. In the fog, Tigers and Panthers stalked them from the woods. Shells tore through the snow. turning the quiet forests into infernos of fire and ice. Entire companies were cut off, surrounded, forced to fight in isolation. Yet even here, the Sherman's resilience showed its worth. Crews kept engines running through the night to prevent them from freezing solid. Mechanics worked in the dark, using the glow of burning fuel to weld armor plates. When a tank broke down, another crew towed it forward. When one was destroyed, replacements arrived before dawn. The Germans broke through at first, but they couldn't hold. Their tanks ran out of fuel, their convoys were bombed from above, and their armored spearheads stalled in the snow. American supply lines, stretched but unbroken, poured in reinforcements faster than the enemy could believe possible. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the U.S. 101st Airborne and attached Sherman units held firm. They endured artillery barrages and tank assaults until the skies cleared, and when Allied aircraft returned, the counterattack began. By January 1945, the German offensive collapsed. The Wehrmacht had gambled its last armored divisions and lost them. Hundreds of tanks lay abandoned in the snow, their engines seized, their crews captured or dead. In the aftermath, German engineers once again inspected captured Shermans. Their tone had changed entirely from 1942. Reports no longer mocked its design. They praised it. One internal document, issued by the Heereswaffenamt, Army Weapons Office in February 1945, summarized what German officers had learned. The American tank is mechanically reliable, produced in enormous numbers and repaired with extraordinary speed. Its armor is sufficient, its gun adequate, but its strength lies in the efficiency of its maintenance and replacement. That was a confession, not of defeat in battle, but of defeat in philosophy. Germany had built the finest tanks of the war, but not the war-winning tanks. The Americans had proven that in modern warfare, a functional army was worth more than a flawless one. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the last resistance began to crumble. Bridges that the Germans tried to destroy were rebuilt in days. Shermans poured across them, leading convoys that stretched for miles. From Cologne to the Ruhr, the Shermans became symbols of the inevitable end. They crushed through factory towns that had once supplied German industry. They overran airfields filled with wrecked aircraft and fuelless trucks. The machine that had started as a stopgap weapon was now the steel backbone of victory. In April, when the U.S. Army reached the Elbe River and linked up with Soviet forces advancing from the east, the war in Europe was effectively over. Sherman stood beside T-34s, two philosophies of industrial war meeting at the ruins of a continent. The Germans who surrendered knew what they were witnessing. The Tiger had been the king of the battlefield, but the Sherman had been the engine of victory. In Berlin, where the Third Reich was collapsing, the lessons were already being written down by surviving engineers and officers. They concluded that no amount of technical brilliance could withstand the relentless power of an organized, mechanized democracy. In the final days of April, the same type of tank that had first stunned engineers in the African desert now rumbled through German cities, its tracks echoing off shattered walls. For the men inside, the war's end was near. For the engineers who had studied them, the realization was absolute. They had built masterpieces. America had built machines that never stopped. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world surveyed a landscape of steel and ash. Tanks lay abandoned along roadsides, in craters, and beside rivers, monuments to a war that had been fought as much by machines as by men. Among them, the Sherman stood out, not for its beauty but for its presence. It was everywhere. From the deserts of Africa to the ruins of Berlin, it had been the constant companion of the Allied advance. It was the first tank to land in French Morocco, and the last to roll through the streets of Munich. More than 49,000 had been built, each one part of a network of factories, railways, and workshops that had turned America into an arsenal without equal. The war had proven that the battlefield was no longer just about tactics or bravery. It was about logistics, maintenance, and the ability to keep fighting after each loss. The Sherman embodied that truth. When the U.S. Army's technical teams analyzed captured German vehicles after the war, they found engineering that was breathtaking and impractical. The Tiger's gun could penetrate nearly any Allied tank, but its transmission failed constantly. The Panther's sloped armor was revolutionary, but its engines caught fire. In contrast, the Sherman's records showed astonishing consistency. Its mean time between failures was lower than any comparable vehicle. Crews reported that even after weeks of continuous movement, their tanks remained operational. These findings shaped the U.S. Army's post-war doctrine. Future tanks would no longer be designed in isolation. They would be part of a system, maintainable, standardized, and easy to produce. The lessons of the Sherman became the foundation for every American tank that followed, from the M26 Pershing to the M48 Patton, and eventually the M60 and M1 Abrams. To military engineers, the war had settled the debate that had begun in the 1930s: perfection versus production. Germany had built the most advanced machines. America had built enough of them to win. Even the Soviets took note. Soviet engineers, who had built their own legend with the T-34, examined captured Shermans provided through Lend-Lease. They respected the American tank for its reliability, its mechanical layout, and the ease with which its parts could be replaced. In design meetings of the early Cold War, those observations helped shape their own post-war armored vehicles, mass-produced, rugged, efficient. In Germany, surviving engineers like Heinrich Kniepkamp and others studied the aftermath with humility. They recognized that the very qualities they once mocked, standardization, interchangeability, simplicity, had defined the new era of warfare. Their reports, later used by Allied occupation authorities, acknowledged that the Sherman had not only defeated the Panzer on the battlefield, but also in the factory and the supply line. The cultural perception of the Sherman, however, was more complex. To American veterans, it was both savior and coffin. It had carried them through Europe but burned quickly when struck. For many, its reliability was a double-edged sword. It brought them home, but at a terrible cost to those who went first. Still, its reputation grew. In films, newsreels, and museums, the Sherman became a symbol of American resolve. Not perfect, not invincible, but unstoppable. In 1946, when the U.S. Army conducted its post-war review of armored warfare, one report summarized the lesson in a single sentence: the strength of American armor lay not in a single machine, but in the system that kept the machine alive. That system would become America's military doctrine for the next half-century, from Korea to the Persian Gulf. American tanks would inherit the Sherman's legacy, the belief that mobility, logistics, and maintainability win wars long before the first shot is fired. In the ruins of Europe, German engineers who once admired precision now studied simplicity. And for the rest of the century, the world's armies, Soviet, British, French, and American alike, would design not for glory, but for reliability. The war had ended, but the age of the Sherman had just begun. Peace didn't end the Sherman story, Mao. It extended it. When the world began to rebuild, the Sherman kept rolling. By 1946, surplus tanks filled storage yards across America and Europe. Some were scrapped, but many were shipped to allies around the globe. Nations rebuilding their militaries after the devastation of World War II found the Sherman to be the perfect foundation. Easy to maintain, easy to modify, and still formidable in combat. In 1950, when war erupted again on the Korean Peninsula, the Sherman returned to battle. Facing Soviet-built T-34s across the hills and rice paddies, it proved its worth once more. Though nearly a decade old, its dependable mechanics and flexible design allowed it to adapt to the new terrain. American and South Korean crews fought fierce duels in mountain passes, where the tank's mobility and durability outweighed its age. It wasn't invincible, no tank ever was, but it was ready. And in war, readiness is everything. In the following decades, the Sherman became the most widely used tank in the world. It served in more than 40 countries, from the deserts of Israel and Egypt to the jungles of Burma and the plains of South America. Each nation modified it to suit its needs. The Israelis upgraded its gun and armor, creating the powerful M51 Super Sherman. The French adapted it for colonial conflicts in Indochina. Even South American nations used it into the 1980s. Everywhere it went, it carried the same reputation, not as a perfect weapon, but as a trustworthy one. In Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War, Shermans, 2 decades old, still faced Soviet T-54s and T-55s. Though technologically inferior, they continued to fight effectively, supported by air power and tactics that echoed Patton's doctrine of mobility and coordination. The tank that had liberated France now defended the Middle East. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Sherman became a museum piece and a monument. Veterans restored them, drove them in parades, and stood beside them as living reminders of the era when America's factories turned the tide of history. The lessons it taught remained timeless. In the Pentagon's post-war evaluations, the Sherman became a case study in the economics of warfare, how quantity, reliability, and logistics can overcome even the most formidable opposition. Military academies still reference its design philosophy when teaching strategy, that a weapon is only as effective as the system that sustains it. In the Cold War years, American tank design carried the Sherman's DNA. The M48 Patton and the M60 inherited its emphasis on reliability and logistical simplicity. The M1 Abrams, though vastly more advanced, still embodies the same principle, that no tank, no matter how advanced, wins alone. It wins because it moves, because it survives, because it can be repaired and returned to the fight. The Sherman's influence also extended beyond the military. It became a cultural artifact, a symbol of the industrial age's triumph over tyranny. Artists, filmmakers, and historians returned to its image again and again. In films like Fury, Kelly's Heroes, and Patton, it wasn't just a prop, and it was a character, a visual metaphor for resilience and sacrifice. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of the Sherman lies in what it taught both sides. To the Americans, it confirmed that democracy's greatest strength was organization, the ability to mobilize talent, industry, and will into one coordinated effort. To the Germans, it was a sobering reminder that genius without scale is self-defeating. By the 1960s, many of the same engineers who once tested captured Shermans were working for NATO countries or advising post-war defense industries. They often referenced the American tank when discussing standardization and modular design. In a sense, they became students of the very machine they once underestimated. Today, more than 80 years after its creation, hundreds of Shermans still exist, restored, preserved, sometimes even running. They sit in museums from Normandy to Washington, not as relics of destruction, but as symbols of endurance. Each one tells the same story, that wars are not always won by the most advanced, the most elegant, or the most powerful, but by the machine that can move forward, again and again, until the world changes around it. And so, as history looks back, the Sherman remains more than a tank. It is the embodiment of an idea that progress, persistence, and practicality can achieve what perfection never could. When the last Sherman was retired from service, its steel was already rusting, but its legacy was not. Across the world, it remains parked in silent rows at war memorials and museums, a machine that speaks louder in stillness than it ever did in motion. Its paint is faded, its treads cracked, but the story it carries endures. A story of men who climbed inside not because they sought glory, but because someone had to keep moving forward. The Sherman wasn't born from genius. It wasn't an engineering marvel or a technological miracle. It was instead a reflection of something far more enduring: human adaptability. It was designed by pragmatists who understood that wars are not won by dreams of perfection, but by the steady, stubborn refusal to stop. Its story is, in a way, the story of America itself during the Second World War, a nation that built not to boast but to endure. Factories that had once made cars, refrigerators, and typewriters turned into the arteries of global freedom. Every bolt, every weld, every painted star was a promise that democracy, though imperfect, could organize itself into something unstoppable. For the Germans who once studied the Sherman in disbelief, it was a mirror, showing them that in war, the brilliance of one mind can never match the will of millions working together. For the men who fought inside it, the Sherman was not a legend. It was a companion, sometimes loyal, sometimes fragile, always present. It carried them across continents through mud and fire, through fear and exhaustion, until one day, they could finally step out and go home. And for history, it remains a quiet reminder that progress is not always beautiful, but it endures. The Sherman was not the strongest tank, nor the deadliest, nor the most admired, but it was there, in every campaign, in every advance, in every victory that turned the tide of the century. Steel rusts, paint fades, but reliability, the kind built from patience, purpose, and persistence, never truly dies.